Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's special events. All rights are reserved this evening. The event is a private, by invitation only event of the E72nd Street Neighborhood Association. No photographs, recording, retransmission, transcription, or other use of materials presented or contents of this event is permitted without the prior written consent of the E72nd Street Neighborhood Association. Feel free to use the Q&A. I remind you that this is meant to be a constructive and disciplined conversation. If behavior becomes unproductive or comments offensive, you will be removed. And now, please welcome E72nd Street Neighborhood Association Board President, Valerie Mason.
Good evening, everyone, to everyone out there in Zoom land. We have a very serious discussion to get to this evening, but before we do, just a couple of notes about the E72nd Street Neighborhood Association. We were formally organized in 2016 by an extremely dedicated group of volunteers, and our mission is to be involved in the community and the Upper East Side and beyond, in all matters relating to quality of life and our civic duties. We, as we all know, I don't have to tell anybody, are in the midst of an unbelievable health crisis, which has resulted in unimaginable economic hardship. And that crisis has caused and continues to cause much pain. But at the same time, it has caused us or resulted in us being in a pause that has allowed us to look at issues, some issues that we've allowed to sort of just fester and in our daily lives just go by. And it has allowed us to look and examine institutions and start seeing a better way, and to acknowledge, as somebody on this panel has said before, acknowledge what we all know, which is Black lives have and should always matter. And I just wanted to take this opportunity, no matter which political party you belong to celebrate the fact that an African-American South Asian woman will be the first of her race to be nominated by a major party to become a vice president of the United States. And I think in the midst of everything that's going on, we can take some pleasure in that. We are delighted tonight that so many elected officials accepted our invitation right away to talk about these issues and what's trending on the Upper East Side. We also want to thank all of the participants in our poll. We had over 120 responses, and sorry we had to cut it off so we could understand what is going on. We are here tonight to hear what our electeds are doing on our behalf and to let them know what the community concerns are. We don't expect this conversation to be a one and done. This is the first of what we hope are many. I have received a lot of correspondence from the neighborhood, and in terms of specifically, is there going to be NYPD participation on this panel? We thought long and hard about it, but we decided to focus on what our electeds are doing with respect to recent legislation regarding law enforcement and other public safety issues. The 19th precinct has an amazing open door policy. Many of the civic groups on the Upper East Side are in constant communication with our precinct. We very much appreciate that the police force has our best interests at heart and are there for us every day. In fact, I was on the phone with them at 1:30 this morning talking about an issue that a constituent had raised. So I just want to point out that, as I said, this discussion will continue, and we will look at various things that are happening in our neighborhood. And that I just want to point you to the 19th precinct website, because this month there will be many build-a-block meetings. If you're on the Upper East Side, we're divided into 4 sectors, A, B, C, and D. And if you go on their website, you will see that there are upcoming meetings in August. And I encourage all of you to participate in those to create a dialogue between you and the 19th precinct. So without further ado, the way tonight's going to work is we're going to have a presentation from our Congresswoman, Carolyn Maloney, and then we'll get to the panel discussion with some of the more local government officials. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, 12th District. I know she's been in the news a lot lately, but we affectionately know her as the mother of the 2nd Avenue subway. And I just want to say congratulations to Carolyn. She won her primary. And in addition to that, she is the first woman to chair the House Oversight Committee. And we are very proud of that. So Carolyn, I move the microphone over to you to tell us what's happening in law enforcement legislation in the Congress.
Give birth while in office. So
Yeah, that's true.
that was another first. So I know we share being a mother together, and the 72nd Street is very important to me because I used to live on that street. It's a great street. It connects the east and west. It's a fabulous place to live. And I want to thank Valerie Mason and Liz Patrick and the entire East 72nd Street Neighborhood Association for pulling this together. And also all of my colleagues and friends in government. We're working together on so many different things. With Rebecca Seawright, we both share having been attacked with anti-Semitic markings on our offices, and I responded by passing this year, actually making it a law, teaching Holocaust education in our schools with lesson plans, $10 million grant for a centralized database at the Holocaust Museum. So that's happening, and also with the East Side Esplanade, the 2nd Avenue subway, we've all worked on it. But we're here today on crime. And what is happening in the federal government is that we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We passed it through the House, and it was the first ever bold, comprehensive approach to hold police accountable, end racial profiling, and change the culture of law enforcement, empower our communities, and build trust between law enforcement and our communities by addressing systemic racism and bias to help save lives. This bill would establish a national standard for the operation of police departments. It would mandate data collection on police encounters, reprogram existing funds to invest in transformative community-based policing programs, and streamline federal law to preserve excessive force and establish independent prosecutors for investigations. It would end racial and religious profiling, but very importantly, save lives by banning the chokeholds and the no-knock warrants. The no-knock warrant, they broke into Breonna Taylor's home and killed her. They absolutely made a mistake on the address, and this is just outrageous that a person would be killed in their own bed by our own police force. So we're demanding warrants before you get into a home. Make sure you're going into the right home if you're going about after a bad actor. And it's really a terrible thing. And it requires that deadly force be used only as a last resort, and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques first, and changes the standards to evaluate whether law enforcement's use of force was justified. And it does many, many other things I'm going to put up on my website tonight, a complete outline of everything that they do. So if you wanted to hear another hour about what this important bill would do, it will outline it. But I recall when I was on the city council and we had the same type of tensions that we're having right now in law enforcement and communities. Mayor Dinkins started something called community policing. And what this was is that the community went out and walked with our police officers to show our support for them and to open up dialogue with people. I will tell you that I've lived through many terrible things in New York, 9/11, Sandy, the economic crisis, but by far has been the COVID problem. Very briefly, we are in talks now with the Republicans. The Democrats have a $3 billion package that $3 trillion package we're trying to push through. The Republicans have a $1 trillion. We've said, let's meet in the center at $2 trillion. We have top of our list, helping our cities and our states reimburse themselves for the loss of revenue due to COVID. Mayor de Blasio says that he has a $9 billion gap. Governor Cuomo says he has a $30 billion gap. And both are saying if the federal government can't come in and help them, then they will have to raise taxes and cut services to balance their budgets. Both we don't want to happen, so I am fighting very hard on that so that you know that. In terms of policing, nothing is more important than protecting our people. And the amount of concern that our neighbors are having about the violence in our community is extremely disturbing. And I think it is causing more people to think about moving out than COVID, 9/11, financial crisis, taxes, or anything else. So having peace and security in our neighborhoods are important. I want to share a program that Mayor Deakins started, and I'm going to call the 19th Precinct and join them in walking the community this Saturday when they do some of their community rounds. What we did to de-escalate tensions back in the 80s was bringing the community closer together and discussing how the problems that were there and how to react to them. So if anybody would like to join me on a neighborhood walk with the police on Saturday, let me know. And I look forward to hearing all of the ideas and the challenges that you're talking about and seeing if there's any type of federal response that can be helpful to you. I yield back. I could talk all night, but I want to hear what the community has to say, and that's the purpose of this. This is an important bill. We hope to pass it in some form through the House and have it past the House, through the Senate, and signed by the President this year. I yield back to the organizer of this. Valerie, thank you for including me in this important meeting.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Maloney. And can we get the details in terms of what time your walk on Saturday is going to start, or is that something we should call the office and get more details or look at the website?
Find out, and I have to call the precinct and find out when they're walking, where they're walking, what time we could join. And I think it's a nice way to support them. Police and fire they put their lives at risk for us too. Unjustified, massive, violence is not supported by anyone. It's got to end. That's what this bill does. But also, I think it's one way to diffuse the tensions. It was very successful when we did it. Everybody went out and walked with the community, with the police. That's it. I yield back.
Sounds like I'm really looking forward.
My colleagues in government and neighbors. Nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to move to the panel portion of the discussion, and I'm going to introduce the members of the panel that we're going to have now, and we have some questions that we'll ask, and I'll ask them as the moderator, and then hopefully we'll have some time after a panel discussion that we are basing basically on the questions that we received via the poll and the sentiment that was expressed by our residents. We have over 330 people registered for tonight. I don't know if they're coming in, and actually they're coming in as we're talking, but we're very excited that so many people are interested in this. So I'd like to start by introducing the members of our panel, and then we're going to dive right in with the questions. So turning to our panel, we're delighted to welcome Councilmember Ben Kalos from the District 5, Council District 5. Full disclosure, Ben is one of the founding members of the East 72nd Street Neighborhood Association, and we want to thank him for encouraging us to form it. Then there's Council Member Keith Powers from Council District 4. If you're confused about what council district that you're in, if you live on the west side of 2nd Avenue going towards the park, you're in Keith Powers district, and if you go on the east side of 2nd Avenue down to the river, or if you're viewing us from Roosevelt Island, you're in the Ben Kalos district. In addition, I'm happy to welcome our state senator, Liz Krueger, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, as well as state assembly members Rebecca Seawright and Dan Court, and they represent the 76th and 73rd assembly districts respectively. respectively, sorry. I never really realized how big those districts were until I sat at the Board of Elections doing some ballot watching and realized how many people are in these districts. So I admire all of you for the work that you do on behalf of all of us. Let me start by saying what you're seeing on the screen right now. We had asked a question as to what your 3 most important public safety concerns. And I can actually say that before COVID began, the biggest concern in this community was bicycles. Unfortunately, that has changed since COVID. And right now, the 3 most important public safety concerns are the increase in violent crime, homelessness, but not to be forgotten, bicycles. So again, I want to thank everyone for not even hesitating to participate in the panel. And so let's dive right in. I'm going to ask my first question, and it is basically the following. The City Council, in a vote of 32-7 with the support of our mayor, passed a budget which cut the New York Police Department budget by $1 billion. These cuts in police funding come at a time where we're all seeing it in the newspaper when violent crime is rising in the 19th precinct. For example, over the last 28 days, we've experienced 27 robberies versus 7 last year, and 14 armed robberies versus 1 last year, for a whopping 1,300% increase. So I'm going to ask our council members to start off by saying, do you believe these do you believe the budget cuts and the recent legislation have emboldened criminals to become more aggressive?
I'll start, and then I can hand it over to Ben. And I'll let Ben talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of the budget. But I'll start by saying today, even today in New York City, the mayor has basically asked every single social service agency and every single agency to make further and deepening cuts. And we have to recognize that we're in a fiscal crisis. And as you think about the pandemic, the fiscal crisis, the uncertainty of this moment, it is I am, and I think everybody here is deeply concerned, especially on the uptick in violent crime, and particularly those that include guns. And I think we're going to talk about guns in a little bit, but it's extremely clear to all of us that we need a larger solution around gun violence, particularly illegal guns that are making their way into New York City, which continues to be the biggest problem we have. The state elected officials have done almost everything they need to do. I would say everything they need to do to tackle our gun laws here in New York City. They're still coming in, and we need a solution that is much larger than just New York State, that is national. And I'm not going to get political, but we do need a national government that will actually take on federal laws that will bring in guns into our city. And it's not really our neighborhood entirely. It's a number of concentrated precincts here. On the budget, we are facing a fiscal crisis like we have not seen. I certainly have not seen in my age, and I think nationwide we're seeing an increase around shootings and gun violence. I don't think it's alone to New York City, and I think it is tied to a number of factors that are pandemic related. I'm just going to answer your question. I don't think our budget decreases here around the NYPD are through attrition. And so that means that we are delaying classes, we are cost controls around overtime, we switched out functions around, particularly on school safety agents, we switched them to different agencies. There was a big conversation that needed to be had about the role of the police department, which should be focused on violent crime and getting guns off the streets and things like that, in places where perhaps they didn't need to be involved in the day-to-day functions of that other agencies could perform. But when you're talking about anything that's happening, particularly right now, the cuts that we focused on were through attrition. You will see you will see over the course of this fiscal year a decrease in the head count. But things that are happening right now, I don't believe are tied. I want to be really clear. I don't think are tied to the budget or to new laws that we passed. Some that are even getting challenged right now in court. I think we are in a flashpoint. I'll just be honest. I think we are in a flashpoint moment right now with a lot of factors that are going into an uptick in particularly violent crime and particularly those that are involved with firearm. And I think we're going to do a lot to address getting guns off the street. On the particular budget, though, I think it would be impossible for in a few weeks' time to be able to blame a budget that does cost control over the course of a year to reduce headcount on any particular incident that's happening right now. And I do know that everybody on this call has a relationship with our precinct, the 19th precinct. They are responsive. They are, when I call them, I saw somebody, so I do call them in the last few weeks. I've been talking to all my precincts about what's going on. I don't think there's a singular factor here. And I am the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee. I've been talking to the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice a lot about what's driving these numbers. And I think it's a lot of factors that go into it. But as we get to guns, I want to focus a little bit about the need for us to desperately take steps.
Ben?
Sure. I want to thank Keith for his leadership on criminal justice. I'll just do a quick thing for folks who may not know me. So I'm Councilmember Ben Kalis. I do want to thank Valerie and Liz and the rest of the 72nd Street Neighborhood Association for organizing in 2016. And I appreciate the credit from Valerie. I think I'm just here to make sure we support and build as many community neighborhood associations. For my part, like the congress member, I actually grew up on East 72nd at 420 East 72nd with my grandparents and my single mom. We lived together in a 2-bedroom. I went to Park East Synagogue and for day school as well as Bronx Science. Now, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I know there's a couple of other electeds who are parents here. And what I'll tell you is that her safety, my family's safety, and all of our collective safety is a paramount concern. And I will note, you may hear her in the background. This is the new normal, and so please, if you are wearing headphones, you may wish to take them out. My staff says it will help you preserve hearing. This is the new normal. And just while we're talking about safety, for the past couple of months, we've been very focused just on the pandemic. We've opened about 350 beds to treat patients for coronavirus on Roosevelt Island. That's still open. We also opened 200 beds at Hospital for Special Surgery right here in the district at the height of the pandemic. We're also been distributing free masks and sanitizer with your neighborhood association. If you're on tonight's call, I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to be a building captain to personally or through a building service worker make masks and sanitizers available to your neighbors. We literally have these gigantic gallon jugs that you can refill your personal hand sanitizer with. So happy to do that, and every elected on this call has access to that. And then some of the things Valerie already mentioned, but we've been working closely with 72nd Street Neighborhood Association on bike safety, particularly surveying and grading that reduced the number of e-bikes. We have the Eastside Task Force for Homeless Outreach and Services with Faith Frazier's, one of your leaders, on addressing homelessness in the district, not to mention the new big covered trash cans on every corner in the district that was piloted with your...
Okay, Ben, you gotta go.
Fine, I'll go straight to this. So just to echo some of what Keith was saying about the city's budget, he and I agree 99% of the time. In this case, I actually voted against the document, against the budget, because I felt it wasn't honest in that the police were not actually defunded. And so when people say, oh, we defunded the police, Jesse from my team will paste this into the chat, but there's this great article in City and State that actually shows what the cuts were. I think I'm just very upset. I'll be a little bit more political than my colleague, perhaps, but President Trump lied on national TV saying that the city had fired police as a result of the budget. And I can tell you there are police officers who actually killed a man on video, killed Eric Garner on video, and only one of the 5 has actually been terminated. So we are not seeing the reduction in a headcount in an immediate way. And I'd actually even go further to say that today, in 2020, we have more police officers than Bloomberg had and more police officers than Giuliani had. And we still remain one of the biggest police forces in the country. We spend over $6 billion a year on it. And I think when we talk about what's going on, I don't think that anything with funding, and just to be very, very clear, $400 million was moving school safety agents. Those are the nice people who greet you at the door of a school, from the NYPD budget to the DOE budget. That was the only change. We moved, I think we did a $10 million move for the people who write traffic tickets from NYPD to DOT. We moved the homeless outreach responsibilities, which we'll go into, from NYPD to DHS. And then we said we would cut the NYPD's overtime budget by $250 million, but the Independent Budget Office for the City of New York has already come back and said we're likely to go over budget for police overtime by $400 million. So one thing I will tell you is the City Council is going to have to go back and make more cuts in November. And I'm sure you hear from our state electeds that that's going to happen too.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, so I think what I hear each of you saying is we have the same number of police we had before. And what I want to say to you is, in this community, before COVID, we are one of the most densely populated areas of the city. And if you ask the people of my association and in Community Board 8, they would tell you that we were under-policed before COVID. And since our crime rate is going up, not down, they would almost, I think, without even going into the chat room and hearing the questions, would say, we didn't think we had enough police. So I hear what you're saying in terms of natural attrition, Keith, but I think, I mean, is that something that has room to be reconsidered if the crime rate continue? If this isn't just a flashpoint, and hopefully we get back on our feet in terms of getting back to whatever normal is going to be like going forward, and you don't think we will need them, or is there going to be some move to address this, because it's sort of a catch-22. You need to have tax revenues, but if people don't feel safe about living here, it's kind of hard to get those tax revenues back up. Anybody can jump in.
Thinking about that, you good.
Can you pull up one of your slides? You had a slide, I think the second to last slide, that showed members' responses about different duties that folks were interested in seeing reallocated from the police. Do we have that slide?
I don't know. We only had 2 slides for this. I don't know. Go ahead, keep talking. Aaron will
sure.
try.
I think what we're looking at is using the right skills and tools for the job. So I think one of the things we've been guilty of, and I've been in the council when we increased the number of police by 1,500, and one of the problems that we're seeing in the budget is everything we're looking at is through the lens of more policing. So when it comes to homeless in the neighborhood, what the survey results came back with is I think 80 to 90% of the residents who responded felt that we should move that away from NYPD. We don't need a police officer with a gun to be there to do homeless outreach in most cases. We're on the precipice of a huge eviction crisis where we will see homelessness like we've never seen before in our lifetime. And we're going to need people not with guns, but with somebody who can help a person get housing.
Okay.
And I just want to add one thing, but I know you want to go on to the next subjects, and I don't want to take.
No, well, I just go ahead, Keith.
Oh, sorry. I just have to say, I mean, we are in a fiscal crisis, and right now, even today, agencies and social services across the board, which are part of the public safety, social safety net of the city, are getting decimated. And every agency, NYPD, down on parks, everything, because of our financial condition right now, absent getting new funding sources to help fill those gaps or some other way to fill borrowing or some other authority here, we are going to have to make really hard choices in the next couple of years. It's going to be filled just with very tough decisions. And if we don't make cuts in certain places, we also then end up defunding CUNY, we defund foster care, we defund a lot of the basic social safety net programs that we rely on that I think are tied into the public safety system here. And we are going to have to, I just want to say this because it's going to be, I'm going to have to repeat this a couple of times, but like, the next couple of years are going to be really hard. And we are going to have to follow the numbers and the data locally and citywide to see and how to address the trends in violence and violent crime and to keep our communities safe and to make sure we locally, but the whole city is safe. But I do not look forward to these budgets in the years ahead. I don't think Ben does either, where every choice we make is going to be filled with really tough decisions. So it is a time we all have to roll up our sleeves and make those choices. Some of it's going to include things that we care very deeply about, but we're going to have to find a balance. And that's going to be our job, is to find the right balance. And I do think that's what we try to aspire to do here.
Right. And I think, we'll move on, but I think that goes back to what Carolyn Maloney is saying about getting help from the federal government to sort of tie to really fill in the gap and address all the money that we spent on COVID that was probably supposed to go to something else, and that tax revenue that was lost during that period through no fault of anybody's. It belongs, coming back to the state and local government. So we appreciate that too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just move on. I do want to talk a little bit though I wanted to let Keith just speak briefly about the enforcement of the gun control laws and what effect you think that has in this flashpoint.
Yeah, I said a little bit of it, but I'll go just a few. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers, I've been looking as this violence has risen, talking with the mayor's office, and the numbers are concerning when you think about how many guns come in from out of state. I'm doing this stuff about 85%, I think, of guns, handguns, 75% of all guns that are recovered in a scene of a crime are from out of state. I think 7% of them, I tweeted this out the other day, are in the possession of the person who actually, the possession of the people who actually purchased them. And the guns are predominantly coming from 6 states in our region
what are those states? So if we have friends there, we can tell them to log in.
I'll get you the whole list, but it's the Carolinas, it's Virginia, it's other states that maybe have ideologically some different views of guns than we do, but also have very weak laws. And those guns, and there's a really good report that we could circulate from the Attorney General's office a few years ago, the prior Attorney General, that really digs into these details. You can go to every town for gun safety. They have some really good comparisons of states, but you can see states that are 5 hours away that it's not hard to buy a gun and bring it to New York. There aren't laws about if you get a gun stolen from a gun shop or from your possession that you have to report it. New York has great laws. We have done a pretty good job of it. We need to still recover those guns when they get here. But we have a problem that is, partially New York, but also partially other cities have it too, which is our neighboring states are not doing their duty to get the guns off the street. And
well, let me ask you a question. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in.
Go ahead.
But, what about, especially in an economic hardship time, offering people money for their guns?
So gun buybacks, yeah.
That works.
Some of them work, but you're not going to get guns. You're not necessarily going to get guns out of people who don't want to give their guns up. So they work in some cases, but there are still people that don't want to give up their illegal guns because they may want to use them, or they're not, going to a gun buyback. And so I think that, I don't want to just talk about states outside of New York. I know this is about our community, but in the city, the guns that are coming in are predominantly and largely from places where it's not the person who purchased it who has the gun committing a crime with it. And it is we should all be demanding very loudly that we have a federal response to guns. Basic background check.
I want to thank our state legislators for patiently waiting. You're part of this conversation too. And I think I'm going to start with a question that, over the last 3 weeks, everyone has been talking about what has bail reform done? And so I'm going to open it up. I think there's been some discussion amongst the three of you about telling us, this legislation is almost brand new. It got off to a rough start. Liz, Rebecca, and Dan, do you want to tell us where we are with it and whether you think it's had any impact on where we are? And I'm going to take Keith's point and call it this flashpoint that we're in right now.
I'd love to answer that one if I can first. Hi, everyone. First off, thank you, Valerie, Liz, and the other members of the 72nd Street Association for inviting us all here tonight. And I take you at your word that this is just the beginning of discussion that's going to need more discussion. I agree completely. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what the bail law that the state passed changed. No, it is not creating a revolving door, and there is no data showing that it is. The purpose of bail is to simply ensure people return to court for their court dates. It was never intended to be a model for decreasing further criminality, and it wasn't. Individuals who committed crimes pre-reforms would still be out on the street if they had the money, but all these huge numbers of low-income people who didn't have the money to leave a message after the tone. And
I'm trying to reach Ray Hughes. Ray, this is Chris Mason, Nixon
Hey,
Peabody.
that's my
If I
husband.
have your correct number, which I hope I do, can you please give me a call?
Chris, mute. There you go.
I didn't think he had the power to do that. Sorry, Liz. Now she's muted.
Now, Liz, you're muted.
I don't know what's going on.
Mute. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So I was saying the bail is not impacting violent criminals or people accused of violent crimes being back on the streets. Our changes made it a more fair system, so we weren't locking up poor people for non-violent charges prior to their day in court. It's only non-violent level offenses that who don't get monetary bail conditions. And the research coming out of New York City and the entire state is that people who are out on bail are not committing violent crimes afterwards and being either a revolving door or in a situation where they are our new criminals while they're awaiting trial. We did make a few changes after the first version of the law. But again, just to clear up what we think police and DAs were perhaps confused about, that they still had the power to keep people in if they felt that they were violent or at risk. So the new law allows individuals who commit a new felony or an A misdemeanor, and Dan Court can explain those terms better than me, while out on release for another felony or a misdemeanor, that they on a second time would have bail or be required to stay in jail pending their court case. The new law also allows bail to be set on any felony if charged, and if convicted could result in the individual being required to be sentenced for a felony conviction. This does not require that the offenses are bail eligible offenses. And finally, the new law allows bail to be set where an individual is charged with committing a felony offense while serving a sentence of probation or while on post-release supervision. Because there's also some perception that we're letting people out of jail more quickly, or in some cases on a COVID argument, but everyone who has been released early from our state jails were people who were in jail only for a violation of probation or parole, not for any kind of violent crime at all. And if they get caught when they're out, there is no option but to put them back in. So they pay a really high price. So you got put in jail because you were late to your appointment with your probation officer. Then you get released on a COVID argument and you do something else, you are going back to jail, no discussion, no review by court, no bail argument. So again, there seems to, in my opinion, Valerie, be misinformation being spread that if we are seeing significant new rates of certain crimes, they must be the people who are on release without bail or who have been let back into our communities. And the data, even the New York Post, which is not necessarily the most liberal of media outlets, even the New York Post has just this week had 2 different articles confirming that the crime issues, the shooting issues have nothing to do with the changes we made in bail or the other state law changes we made either. Maybe I'll stop for now.
Dan, Rebecca, I just want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to add anything to that.
Rebecca, you want to jump in or?
Yeah, I mean, we can.
Senator Krueger did a very good job, so I can be brief. Neither the changes, and there have been multiple changes in the bail law, nor as Councilmember Powers and Kalos set forth, nor anything that happened in the city budget several weeks ago has anything to do whatsoever with the rate of crime. And that would be the same whether the rate of crime decreased or has it increased in certain levels. Those who use language such as catch and release or other things, we should all be honest. they're entitled to their views on the bail laws or the city budget, but not their view of the facts. There is no connection whatsoever between any changes we made on the bail laws in Albany or what the council and the mayor recently did on budgets with the NYPD budget and the increase of crime in certain criminal conduct in our neighborhood. So that is simply disconnected from fact. One point on the bail law, just to understand what we're really talking about here, during the last protests, approximately 170 to 180 individuals were arrested for engaging in quote unquote looting. And I say quote unquote because there's no actual crime of looting. It's engaging in the destruction of property, different from engaging in the destruction of property with intent to injure. That's a different type of crime. The argument was made by our district attorney here that he needed extra powers within the bail laws because he needed to make sure these people were locked up pre-trial to ensure that sort of conduct would not happen again. Of the overwhelming majority of that 170 or 180 people, none of them were rearrested. And that goes virtually none. I can get you the exact numbers, but a very small percentage. Goes back to what bail ought to be, a release mechanism to ensure return to court, not a punitive measure of punishment where no one has found that individual guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of anything. That's just one example. I think that speaks to how the bail laws have no connection whatsoever to our current rates of crime in the 17th and 19th precinct neighborhoods.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to add, I do a lot of work with criminal justice involved women. And, you know, when you can't meet bail, you're put in a jail alongside of somebody who's serving an actual sentence and you haven't even been convicted of a crime yet. And so if you are poor, you're serving a sentence even before you start, even if you haven't been convicted, and it's not a very pleasant place to be. No. So I hear what you're saying. I just wanted, we'll move to another question, but do you see, I know you're not in the DA's office, Dan, but are you noticing that any prosecutions, is any of you seeing a failure or to prosecute, and that's trickling down? Any of you hearing anything about that?
I think there has been some misinformation in the press that because the courts have been closed for quite a while, that prosecutions weren't going on, or that criminals were actually being let go rather than meeting their legal obligations. And I have spoken to the courts and the Legal Aid Society, which represents a disproportionately large number of poor people arrested on criminal activity. And they have all assured me that the court process has been happening. Arraignments have been happening. Court hearings have been happening. They've been on Zoom like we are, but that they didn't stop doing their jobs, and they have been processing correctly under legal grounds. Interestingly, what's happened at this higher crime period, there's fewer arrests by the police. And we know now from the city council members, there's not an obvious reason that there's fewer police to do arrests, but for some reason they are making fewer arrests. And that might be part of the concern the community ought to have and be exploring about what's happening if there are increased crime categories, I think particularly economic crimes, and there are fewer police arrests. But I am very confident that the courts are handling the cases, and they did not stop.
Right. Well, I very much appreciate that. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have these Build-A-Block meetings coming up. And so that's a fair question to be asked at those meetings to get a different perspective. Rebecca, I just wanted to say, you know, the Congresswoman mentioned that you actually were a victim of a crime yesterday.
And today.
Oh, today too. Sorry, I've been a little busy. I haven't really been, that's terrible to hear. So our deepest sympathies about that. We were all feeling for you. And if you want to.
Thank you, Valerie.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to Liz Patrick and to all of your members. What wonderful timing for this forum this evening. I'm always so impressed to hear about the initiatives of the East 72nd Street Neighborhood Association and your bike delivery report card. has been wonderful. But yesterday, upon opening our community office on 79th and York Avenue, we did discover vandalism and hate-filled anti-Semitic note at our doorstep. And today at our campaign office, there was more of the same. We hosted a press conference yesterday joined by prominent interfaith leaders to decry any acts of intolerance in our community. And, you know, we'll never be intimidated by this criminal act. And we've called for a hate crime investigation from the NYPD. Thank both the governor and the mayor and electeds for their messages of support. We denounce this disgraceful and hateful crime, and we will remain vigilant. New York is currently facing unprecedented challenges through this once-in-a-lifetime public health crisis and economic recession, rising unemployment, racial injustice, and police brutality, and now an eviction and homelessness crisis. Now is the time for New Yorkers to be united in their resolve and their resilience. Senator Krueger and Assemblyman Cord and Councilmember Kalos and Powers have done an excellent job laying out their positions. And, you know, I agree that, you know, bail is not and was never meant to be a punishment, just to ensure that a person returned to court. And it hasn't been in effect a year. And I agree with Senator Krueger that the data that's coming in hasn't shown that it's a revolving door. Changes can be made if needed, but the data available now that I've seen is showing that it's not causing more crime. But I think after a year, we can look at the reports, the data, and the information and assess if we need to go back and tweak the law.
Okay.
So that's my position. And
well, yeah,
yes.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry to hear that you had another incident today. I want to talk about some legislation that was definitely moved forward by the unfortunate events in Minneapolis, which was the repeal of 50A, which had been sitting around for a very long time with they had basically just to blow the dust off of it and finally get moving, which essentially now makes officer disciplinary records available to the public. And for our audience, that data is available to everyone. You can go on propublica.org and look up every precinct in the city of New York and see what's going on. Again, it's the open door policy of the 19th precinct. I sat down with Inspector Walsh and Detective Lombardi last week and we talked about it. I don't think anyone would be surprised to find that there were not very many complaints against the officers at the 19th precinct, and that the data that was in the hopper, so to speak, is over a 6-year period. And for the officers, and there were not that many who had multiple complaints. Inspector Walsh told me that those officers are no longer at the 19th precinct. So I just wanted you to talk about that law, how you know, I know it was a heavy lift because it took a long time to get done, but how you feel about it and what do you think it means going forward?
I'll start off on this. The efforts by police unions and the political efforts by those who supported police unions over the last 9 years while I was in Albany to prevent disclosure of personnel records was one of the most self-defeating political adventures that I've ever seen. Think about it. Every other city employee has their personnel records not disclosed automatically to revert to FOIL, where non-relevant information, biographical information, address information can be redacted so that there isn't a Gawker mentality. But when we talk about the NYPD, those imbued with incredible powers and weapons, police personnel records were hidden from public view. And that was largely a political effort. And I'm proud of my colleagues in the legislature with Senator Krueger and Assemblymember Seawright. It is just unfortunate that it took a terrible event in Minnesota to compel that bill to come to the floor and finally get passed. But it is so basic that disciplinary records of the NYPD, especially with the Civilian Complaint Review Board not having the power that it should have to oversee police misconduct, and especially also in light of the failure itself by the NYPD disciplinary process of its own members. And you don't have to take my word for it. The former commissioner, Jimmy O'Neill, actually brought in former U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White to review their own protocols, finding them deficient. But even with that, we still couldn't get 58 passed, unfortunately, until the events happened in Minnesota. So I think it was a good piece of legislation. It was about 15 to 20 years in the waiting, and I think it will have a positive effect, most especially, to your point, Valerie, on so many of the police precincts like the 19th and probably like the 17th that don't have officers with extensive disciplinary hearing. But they paid the price for police unions and the NYPD as a whole in fighting our efforts in Albany to reform the police secrecy laws.
Appreciate that. So if you don't mind, I want to get to this. I never thought I would be talking about this word in the context of policing, but can someone explain the diaphragm clause of the chokehold ban and what all the controversy is about? We basically, we want to understand, in lieu of what is now these ban techniques, what you think is going to be available to the police to make arrests, and what additional training. I mean, we're talking about money all the time here, but this is money that is really, I mean, in some ways going to save everyone money, because when there's trouble and during an arrest, someone gets hurt. At the end of the day, people's lives are lost, and money is, lawsuits, settlements, etc. So can you tell us some of the, again, what the law is about, and what you, by enacting this law, I know it's a city law, but and there's 18, unions that are fighting it, but tell us a little bit about what's going on.
So before we go into the city, we'll defer to our state colleagues who got there first.
Yeah,
Okay.
the state passed the law first, Valerie, and then the city will just follow up. So thank you, Ben. But we were all thinking of the same things at close to the same time. Again, like bail, I think there's a lot of misinformation about this out there. So the new law establishes the offense of aggravated strangulation, which is committed when a peace officer commits the offense of criminal obstruction of breathing or blood strangulation. Now, this is an offense that is defined as intentional pressure being applied to the throat or neck, intentional. And the fact is, it's always been against New York Police Department rules and regulations now for decades. And yet it was still being used on a number of quite infamous cases. And that's why it became called sort of the diaphragm clause, because you're cutting off oxygen through the diaphragm. It doesn't put police at risk of penalty unless there is criminal evidence of the misapplication and intentional use of a chokehold. All right. And so the police have been trained not to use it for years. They've known not to use it for years. It can only be a penalty if they, in fact, are using it intentionally. Officers have every other mechanism available to them to make an arrest, and they are trained on those models, not even trained on this, to arrest people without using chokeholds, without putting their lives at risk. The law just prohibits the intentional act of applying pressure around the throat of the individual. They can still grapple with someone if they need to, utilize a taser on the person if they need to, have multiple police officers surrounding a person to render them able to be arrested and handcuffed. And if the pressure is accidentally applied to the throat or neck, that does not fall under this law. And I think there's some misperception out there that we are limiting our police officers' ability to do their jobs and arrest people. I don't believe that is the case. We are putting in now state and city law that they cannot use this model. They have not been trained to use it. They have been trained to be able to carry out arrests in any number of ways that we did not change the laws on. And the reason we all care about this so much, Valerie, is you already said it. People have ended up being killed on video where much of the country has risen up in shock and horror. Now that recent case was obviously not in New York, but we have had our own cases here in New York too frequently. And so this was just, we're going to clarify, there's no gray area here. These are not the techniques our police are trained in or supposed to be using.
I agree with Liz, so I'll leave it at that. But I will also say, like, the bill is it's been deemed a diaphragm bill or whatever. It's a chokehold bill, and it's meant to restrict the use of a chokehold that has been in the national news because of the death of George Floyd. And so I think you know, it has been mischaracterized or mislabeled as the diaphragm law. But you should just read the bill. I mean, honestly, people should read the bill.
Yeah, I mean, but how is this disconnect happening, right? Because if I'm listening to Liz and you, it seems very clear that it doesn't seem to prohibit a kind of arrest that you might see on Law and Order every night of the week. And yet, the way that certain people have described it who aren't on this panel right now, they seem to be extremely afraid, perhaps, or are of the opinion that if an arrest was made and, you know, somebody saw somebody's knee at the base of somebody's back and they were up against a wall, that they would be immediately arrested. So it seems like there's something has to be done, and whether it's somebody walking into every precinct or retraining or something that can clear this up. I mean, obviously, I'm a lawyer. I don't think those kinds of lawsuits really help anything, but, you know, for us on the ground, you know, we're kind of in between, caught in between, if you will, somebody's interpretation of the law and what you guys are saying is what is out there. So anybody else want to speak to this? I mean,
I'll just follow the advice from Keith, which is just like, I'm reading the text of the law, and it literally says restricts air or blood by compressing the windpipe or carotid arteries on each side of the neck. So just think about this. A person, you've done something wrong, and they're going to come and then they're going to choke you. That's what we're talking about. And we're also talking about somebody sitting, kneeling, or standing on your chest or your back. So just think about somebody. So I'm 200 and something pounds, and me kneeling on your chest.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, Ben, but, you know, I've never tried to arrest anybody, and so I don't really know what I would, you know, if the person, well, most people are taller than me anyway, but I mean, if that were the case, I don't know what methodology I would use. So I mean,
I would just say that it is not in their, it is a violation of the patrol book. It is not what they are trained to do. I don't want to live in a world where people who are supposed to be on the right side of the law are choking other people so that they cannot breathe or get blood supply, doing so for 9 minutes,
okay,
and for that to somehow be legal.
This may be an unfair question, but, you know, in the legal world, you have continuing legal education. Is there continuing police training? Are there requirements for officers to go back to school, so to speak, and keep up on the latest techniques?
Yeah. No city in America has invested more money in retraining, in removal of implicit bias training or de-escalation training than the NYPD. And I guess I would fall on the idea that had they not spent all that money and all that time over the last 15, 20 years, things would be worse today than what it already is. But historically and systemically, the greatest change of conduct is change of law. So while I applaud the NYPD and for implementing de-escalation training and some type of training, the greatest change of attitude will come from a change of law. And for all the reasons my colleagues explained, this is just common sense. The NYPD itself came to the conclusion that its officers ought not to be doing this. So their protests about us memorializing that in the penal law certainly seems misplaced to me.
And we will paste a video that's available in the Daily News from Detective Vince Caputo of the NYPD's Physical Training and Tactics Department, who has shared multiple humane ways to make arrests in difficult situations that do not involve a chokehold, and that are part of a video training and other training that is being made available to the NYPD to make sure that they, first, they've already been trained on this, but we will be providing this refresher.
Well, I just want to say to the audience, if you look in the chat, there are a lot of documents being posted for people to explore after this discussion so that they can become more educated on what these laws are saying and what the training programs are like. And I think that's very important. I mean, I've actually, you know, one of the debates of that go on around town is what do our police know about martial arts where pressure points other than, you know, in the neck, etc., can be used to subdue people very easily that, you know, again, I keep pointing to myself as somebody who's 5 feet and under, can defend herself against somebody who's 3 times my size by just touching one pressure point. So, I mean, you know, I've never heard that that's part of the training or that there's a constant, as I would say, continuing police training program that people have to do once every 2 years or whatever it is to keep up on the latest techniques.
So Valerie, in the Assembly, I'm co-sponsoring legislation that would require mandatory continuing law enforcement education and to require psychological evaluations. We've only begun to unravel the systematic injustices and to take the first steps toward a trusted relationship between the community and our police. And hopeful that this legislation, when we're back in session, will pass.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back. I mean, again, I think that the repeal of 50A is going to work in favor of both sides of this equation. It's going to make good cops look really good and everyone be able to tell, you know, what people have been saying all along, that, you know, with anything, you know, a few bad apples, you know, taint the whole group. And we know that on the whole, we have a very dedicated and very involved police force that we work very closely with. So I just want to move on a little bit to the last issue, which is not a crime, but it just creates such an amazing public safety concern for the people who are living on the sidewalk and you know, very recently living in hotels on the Upper East Side and on the Upper West Side. And, you know, we understand that the homeless outreach function of the police has really been stopped, and that, you know, if we call the police, they basically turn around and call 311. I really want to hear from everyone on this. I mean, this is a short-term and a long-term issue. We kind of feel that that the crisis has actually spiked during COVID, in part because a lot of these homeless people that were in the subway were evicted from the subway during the evening and are now, you know, living on the sidewalks in somewhat, you know, safe neighborhoods. And unfortunately, many of them are suffering from mental illness. And we are trying very, you know, we work with Ben, we work with Keith, and we try to reach out to these people and do the best we can. But all of you, just an open question. Again, I know we're constrained by funds, but this is really a real crisis because people are afraid to walk down their street because of the mental illness factor, don't know how some of these people are going to react. So I open it up to the group.
if I can jump in, and Liz Kruger was there when, is a co-founder of the Eastside Task Force for Homeless Outreach and Services. Keith's predecessor, now he and so many of the other elected officials have been very involved. And so the price of admission is to be willing to build supportive housing, housing for former homeless people, and that is the only way we're going to get out of this crisis. And so we've built it now across the street from where I live and in my backyard, as it were, and we will build it anywhere and anywhere we can. So if anyone on the call's got space, we want to work with you to build supportive housing. What I will say is we are on the verge of an eviction crisis like we've never seen, and we are going to see more homeless, period, because people will be forced from their homes. We do have the Eastside Task Force for Homeless Outreach and Services. Faith Frazier from your organization is incredibly involved. She is an incredible leader. And what we are doing is working with people, individuals, name by name. If somebody is in housing right now, a friend or a neighbor, and they're afraid that they can't cover their rent, let any of us know, whether it's home base and making emergency payments or connections with nonprofits. We can help people pay their rent, because the best thing we can do is keep people in their housing. We have a right to counsel. If folks' income is over $50,000, our offices have relationships with nonprofits who can provide an attorney that can cover it, because just because you make $50,001 doesn't mean all of a sudden you can afford an attorney. Very few people can. And I just say that we're going to see a lot of people who are homeless just because they couldn't pay their rent because of the pandemic, because 1 in 5 New York City residents is unemployed. There are a group of people who are chronically homeless. The face of homelessness in our city is children. There are 23,000 children who woke up this morning in a shelter. And then we have about 17,000 families. We have about 3,000 single women in our shelter system, about 7,000 single men. We're actually at the lowest census since I started, which is 55,000, down from 65,000. And what I would just say is, if you know somebody, or if you have a relationship with somebody, or you volunteer in a soup kitchen in the neighborhood, and there is anything we can do, we will work with them. We will use your tax dollars to get them supportive housing, to possibly even put them in a hotel, give them a plane ticket, bus ticket back to their family if they've got somebody who's willing to take them back, get them an education, get them whatever they need to get off their streets. I want to kick it over to my state elected officials to help with funding for substance abuse and mental health, because they are the ones who pay for it.
So it is true that the way you've already heard that the city is in a terrible financial position right now, the state, as the Congresswoman pointed out, is technically in a worse position. The Congresswoman said the state has a $30 billion deficit. That's not that bad. Technically, it's over 2 years that we have a $30 billion deficit, up to about $16 billion this year, $14 billion next year. But it means instead of investing more funds in the kinds of programs we ought to, which are substance abuse services, mental health services, we're finding ourselves at a time when we're very likely to continue to cut those programs. And it's one of the secret damaging realities of the pandemic combined with the economic downturn. Ben was fabulous on all the facts of most homeless people are not mentally ill or drug using people lying around on our sidewalks. Some percentage are. And that is also because we don't have these services in place at the community level. And so when people tell me they are upset about homeless people on their sidewalks, I always encourage them to recognize if we get quality programs in their neighborhoods that are residential, they won't be on these streets. They'll hopefully be in a safer environment where there's food and showers and opportunities to take advantages of services. Communities are often frightened about the concept of supportive housing or shelters or other models in their immediate neighborhood. But I believe that when they're done correctly, with responsible not-for-profits providing the services, with responsible security models that coordinate between both the police precincts and the not-for-profit who's running the program, because that's the story most of the time, having quality security, not just in the building, but patrolling the block around the building, what we actually find is that there's decreases in problems in the communities because, again, if you can be talked in from living on a street using drugs to come into a program where there are services, there is food, there is counseling, we can help you get off those drugs, you will no longer be a problem for the community, even though you might be in a residential facility right here in the community. And it is true, there's something that's been going on, I think everyone knows about it, as the city worked very hard to decrease the population of homeless people in the large shelters so that we could have social isolation at risk of COVID, they were using short-term renting of hotel rooms in completely empty hotels. We know tourism's gone for now. Hotels were sitting there empty. People who owned hotels were dying for some economic activity and opportunity. And so the city's been making deals to move homeless people from the shelters into hotels. And it's too expensive a model to last forever, but it was a totally rational model. And I know our rate of COVID in our shelters wasn't significantly different than our overall rate of COVID in the city of New York at this time. And that's actually an amazing statistic, that we did a good enough job that we were able to limit COVID spread in shelters that sometimes had hundreds and hundreds of people in group quarters.
Well, are any of these sites, any of these hotels on the west side, or the Bentley, for instance, which was in the newspaper today as being owned by, two slumlords, and an investigation as to how much they're actually being paid for the people that are living there? I mean, is there any support in those, or are we just talking about people being put in, going back to the 1970s and living in an SRO with no other support? I mean,
there are, I'll just jump in because I have a number of them in Midtown West, as Liz. They are basically the operator of the shelter. They move the population. They had to take half the population. They move them to a hotel, and they bring the provider with them. I actually have a few of them, and it is important to mention, like as Liz said, is like this is not going to be able to be a long-term solution. It is going to be a short-term. A way to help address COVID in the shelters, because it is going to be a very expensive endeavor if you do this over the long term. I just want to mention one other thing on Ben and I both had helped pass a bill in the council. I think it was last year, that does require that when the city starts building new development through HPD, who's our city agency, that they start actually setting aside units to get people out of the shelter system and put them into city subsidized housing. And while there had been some rules in place in the past, we weren't really utilizing them. They were getting knocked out of a lot of the deals. This is to actually start creating, when we spend money in the city to create new housing, actually making sure there's some for people to get out of the shelter system and to move into affordable housing, which is, you won't see the benefits of that yet because of COVID, not a lot of development is been built yet. But as we start building again and the city starts funding these projects, you will start to see units that get set aside. And
I just want to say, Ben is absolutely right. We haven't even seen the real crisis here yet when people start to be evicted. So I think that there has to be some kind of plan that you all are working on. I'm sure you are, to sort of, it's a domino effect, right? If people don't pay their rent, then they can't pay their mortgage, and then the bank comes and forecloses on the property. So there has to be some solution that looks at every piece of the pie. But I just want to say,
Can I speak to the Bentley really quickly?
Sure.
So the Bentley, regardless of who operates it, the city, in order to protect the lives and safety of those who are homeless, we're putting them into double rooms so that they're not in a congregate setting. The operator of that site is the Doe Fund. The Doe Fund has a very positive reputation. Everyone knows George McDonald in the neighborhood, many personally. The Doe Fund has an amazing program for many of the people who are at the Bentley, called Ready, Willing, and Able. And so those are the folks who many of us, I grew up in the neighborhood watching them clean our streets. And so I for one, am grateful, and I welcome them to come to the neighborhood that they've been cleaning and have spent perhaps even a lifetime caring for. And so in terms of the program, it's not, many of the people there are participating in that program and have that. It is not something that they can require of every participant. If anyone has any specific concerns about it, Senator Kruger's office, my office, I know Rebecca Seawright's office too, we've all reached out to Memorial Sloan Kettering, Rockefeller University, HSS, New York Presbyterian, Cornell, and everyone in that hospital corridor, because that area is actually less residential than the rest of the district, to let them know the day that they came in. And if those institutions have any issues, we put them directly in touch with the Doe Fund. We haven't heard complaints from those institutions. That being said, if you're just a neighbor and you have a concern, there are many different supportive housing sites throughout the neighborhood. There are very many different shelter sites throughout the district. And the reason you don't know about all of them is because we try to run them well. So if you have any concerns whatsoever,
I think that's absolutely true. What I wanted to mention is, you know, Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter has been around the Upper East Side for years and years and years, and they run fantastic programs. There are churches all over the churches and synagogues and mosques all over the Upper East Side that run programs in conjunction with other organizations. I mean, I think one of the, you know, look, I remember a community board meeting where we were fighting to keep open a Neighborhood Coalition for Shelter residents in the 70s that was actually closed by the city against the will of the community. So I think this is a community, and I've spoken to many of the again, leaders of the associations, East 86th Street, Treadwell Farm Historic Preservation, East 60s Neighborhood Association. We all want to be a part of this solution. We feel for these people tremendously.
Great, great. And we appreciate that there are so many amazing civic organizations throughout our districts who do exactly what you're describing, Valerie, and understand we're all in this together, and that we end up with better outcomes when we are both communicating well, sharing information, and coming up with solutions together. So,
and I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
We're gonna have another one soon, I promise. But remember, get out there and go to your Build-A-Block meeting.
Great.
Get to know your precinct.
We look forward to your next meeting.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.